Welcome to our Just Talk, Talk Just panel discussion, Womanist Leadership, Reimagining Social Change. Sponsored by Union Presbyterian Seminary's Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. The conversation taking place today is similar to the dialogue that happens in our academic classrooms. Union would love to be in touch with you about opportunities to further your theological education. Please contact our admissions office at admissions@upsem.edu. Our panelists are the Reverend Eustacia Marshall, pastor of New River Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, and Reverend Tracy Blackman, Associate General Minister of Justice and Local Church Ministries for the United Church of Christ, and Pastor in Residence for Eden Theological Seminary. Our host and moderator is Reverend Melanie C. Jones, Instructor of Ethics, Theology, and Culture, and Director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. Reverend Jones, the mic is yours.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's Just Talk, Talk Just webinar, which again is sponsored by the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. In the words of Zora Neale Hurston, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. The stories of Black women's leadership are often missing from leadership studies. Black women in the United States make up the majority of Christian churches while continuing to bear the burden of unequal access to religious leadership in a contemporary era. Womanism represents an approach in religious studies and a prophetic social movement that is committed to the survival and liberation of Black women while dismantling multidimensional systems of oppression. The reality of systemic exclusion uniquely positions Black women to lead with a commitment to care and an eye for justice. Blogger Lovey Ajayi puts it this way: those who have been trampled upon are the ones who know how to lead best without having somebody else's head stepped on. In their salient anthology, Black Womanist Leadership, Tracing the Motherline, Womanist scholars Toni King and Elise Ferguson define leadership as the desire, the ability, and the efforts to influence the world around us based upon an ethic of care for the self and of others that is fueled by a vision that one sustains over time. The second part of Alice Walker's definition emphasizes leadership in the exchange between the mother-daughter dyad or across generations in Mama, I'm walking to Canada and I'm taking you and a bunch of other slaves with me. And the reply, it wouldn't be the first time. Black women represent the architects of social change who often exist on the front lines of social movement. There are countless stories of Black women across generational lines, women like Jarena Lee, who spoke up against the separate and unequal status given to Black women, even in Black churches, women like Ida B. Wells Barnett, who confronted the evil of lynching during the Reconstruction period, women like Fannie Lou Hamer, who exposed the barriers of so-called progressive liberal politics, women like Coretta Scott King, who kept the civil rights movement going globally and locally by staying in the struggle to the very end, and even contemporary Black women today, like Tarana Burke, who in this month of domestic violence awareness continues to help us all say hell no to sexual harassment and sexual violation that continues to trump or to impact women's lives. And then there is the everyday leadership of Big Mama, Ma Dear, Nana, Mama, Auntie Nim, and Sister So-and-so who have known what it means to be essential workers way before such phrases were popular. These are the women who, often without position or prestige, kept showing up, kept stepping up, and never stopped shutting up. The mission of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership is to nurture the soul of Black women as they cultivate pathways to whole communities. We believe when Black women, who represent one of the greatest leadership assets of the Black community, are inspired and equipped, new pathways for social transformation emerge for the betterment of us all. To make it plain, when Black women lead, things change and everybody wins. Tonight's conversation is linked to the Models of Womanist Leadership class in the Master of Public Theology program. We welcome students in this class to this public forum, as well as all of you, Union Presbyterian Seminary community, all visitors, friends, those who have joined us tonight, welcome. We are grateful to convene Black women religious leaders to tell their leadership story and reflect on the pathways to reimagining social change. For those of us who are just joining us, I am Reverend Melanie Jones. I teach ethics and theology here at Union Presbyterian Seminary on the Richmond campus, as well as direct the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. We have tonight our panelists, the Reverend Tracy Devon Blackman, who is the Associate General Minister of Justice and Local Church Ministries for the United Church of Christ and a pastor in residence for Eden Theological Seminary. As a featured voice on many local, national, and international platforms, Reverend Blackman's life work focuses on communal resistance to systemic injustice through the redemptive power of love. Reverend Blackman's religious practice is rooted in principled discipleship that is lived out through congregational and community engagement. Her response in Ferguson to the killing of Michael Brown resulted in national and international recognition, gaining many audiences spanning the breadth of the White House to the Carter Center to the Vatican, and her work is even now featured in several documentaries and print publications. Appointed to the Ferguson Commission by Governor Jay Nixon and to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships for the White House to President Barack Obama, Reverend Blackman is a recipient of the NAACP Rosa Parks Award, the Urban League of St. Louis Woman in Leadership Award, and she is listed as one of Ebony Magazine's Power 100, the St. Louis American Citizen of the Year, and one of the 15 faith leaders to watch in 2020 by the Center for American Progress. Welcome, Reverend Blackman. We also have with us tonight Reverend Eustacia Marshall. Since July 2019, Reverend Marshall has been serving as the pastor of New River Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is a church that is a replant of three historic congregations: Calvin Presbyterian, First African Presbyterian, and Good Shepherd Presbyterian. All three have united to follow God into a new season of ministry. Prior to her pastoral tenure in Philadelphia, Reverend Marshall served churches in New Jersey and North Carolina, and she recently concluded her tenure as the chair of the Board of Trustees for the Presbyterian Foundation, where she served as one of the first Black women to serve in this role. So again, welcome to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us and for the giving of your time for this important conversation. We are so excited and honored to have you. I'm going to jump right in. We are talking about leadership and your leadership journeys, your stories, your experiences. So, Reverend Blackman, Can you tell us what motivated, or give us the narrative about what motivated your leadership beyond the pulpit and into the streets of Ferguson?
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Jones, for having me on the program tonight. I'm honored to be here with you and with Reverend Marshall. And I loved your opening about all the many ways that women lead. For me, serving as a congregational pastor at the time in St. Louis, Missouri, I was 3 miles away. My church was located 3 miles away from where Michael Brown Jr., may his memory be a blessing, lost his life on the streets of Canfield. At that time, I had been called to serve a church that was suffering from some woundedness inside, from church splitting and church disagreements, and also was surrounded by a neighborhood that had changed over the years, manifesting woundedness all around us. The congregation had become quite small. In its heyday, it was 250 to 300 people on a Sunday. And by the time I was called as the first woman pastor there, their attendance was down to about 25, and that was if everyone showed up. So those people who remained were the people who were the remnant of that church, and they were there because they still remembered when, not necessarily because of what was going on right then. They were the ones who had raised their families in those neighborhoods. And even though many of them had moved further out as they gained more status, more education, more money, they still returned to this church because it was home base. At one time, the church had been a daycare, and many of their children had even attended their early educational years in the church. And so they were holding on to who they were and who they were collectively, even in that moment. I always like to tell people in seminaries that one of my first learnings when I came to pastor Christ the King United Church of Christ was that you can't just look at numbers to tell what kind of church it is. I just described to you how the membership had decreased numerically, but when I went to look at the books, the finances had only gone down by 20%. It tells you that there's always a core in the church who is really supporting the ministry financially. And that core remained and they were committed. Of course, they, like everyone else, wanted the church to grow. And that was the task that they brought me in for. And I began wondering how we were going to do that, because the other important demographic for Christ the King is that I could stand in the front of this church, which was a pretty nice sized church. It could seat 500 in the sanctuary. We had a complete fellowship hall with an industrial kitchen. We had 9 classrooms, including classrooms that were scaled for little people as well as for big people. We also had 4 acres of land, outdoor playground. I said we used to be a daycare as well. There was even a house out back where the gardener used to stay in better days. And so we had all this space, but we didn't have enough people to fill it. And one of the first sermon series that I preached when I became pastor there was called The Door of the Church is Open. In Black church, the invitation always comes after the sermon. The door of the church is open. Sometimes we say doors, even though it's just one door, but the door of the church is open. And I played off of that and did a sermon series after taking those members on a field trip around the neighborhood so that we could see together how the neighborhood had changed. It didn't take long to recognize that most of the people living in the neighborhood by that time were no longer owning their homes, they were renting their homes. And not that that matters whether you rent or own, the neighborhood actually looked the same, but it did speak to the transient nature of the people who surrounded the church. The church is right across the street from a school, and the students in that school were then 95% free and reduced lunch. We began to pay attention together about how the neighborhood had changed, how the skating rinks and the movie theaters were gone and had been replaced by liquor stores and payday loan centers, how there weren't activities outside for the kids anymore. There was no bowling alley, there was no Chuck E. Cheese. All of those things had once been in the neighborhood and they were gone. Family restaurants were no longer there. We had McDonald's and we had Popeyes and we had Captain D's, but not places where you could go and sit down as a family. We began to notice that there were increasing bus stops in the neighborhood, where it had typically been a neighborhood where everyone or most of the people had cars. Things had certainly shifted. And though they had shifted this way, the church had not been receiving more people coming in to be members of the church, though many people came looking for assistance at the church. We began to have conversations about what that meant, because the people who remained at Christ the King were largely educated, middle class people with stable backgrounds. And so I started this sermon series called The Door of the Church is Open, because the question was, if you really want to grow, you have to know that if we open the doors, the people that we grow with may not be people who act like you, look like you, have been educated like you, hold the same values as you do. Some of them will and some of them won't. Do you really mean you want to open the doors of this church? And we began to have those conversations. We had those conversations not just from the point of who will come in if you open the doors, but also acknowledging that some folk, no matter what they said, were going to go out if we opened the doors, and began to accept and welcome people, not as our guest, but as belonging to the church. We also made some decisions that we would not just define our place in the community by membership in the church. We decided that we were going to be the church of the community. We were going to be a neighbor instead of a recruiter. And we began to open the doors to our space so that people in the community who had vision, who had dreams, but perhaps didn't have the resources to go and get a spot or go and get a business, could come and start and incubate those businesses in the church, in all this space that we had, at no cost, as long as they made spots available to people in the community. This led to other people coming in from the outside to do ministry. We ended up having a robotics team, and we had a girls' mentor program that met every Friday. Neighborhood community meetings started happening in the church. This motivated the people in the church also, who were already committed to ministry, to do above and beyond. We had one man who built an entire computer lab out of his own resources for senior citizens in the community to be able to come in and do job searches and all those kinds of things. We had other people in the church who began a tutoring ministry for the children at the school next door. Even one of those members who had a degree from one of the institutions and had taught math before he retired, went back to school to learn new math so he could help those students. So they began to be energized. My role in that, because I was working 2 jobs, I told you how many members we had. So I had to have a job that was paying my bills, and it wasn't that one. I was working 2 jobs. My commitment began to be that we would open our church for people to use the sanctuary, even if they weren't members of the church, as long as they weren't charging for whatever they wanted to use in the sanctuary. Consequently, and sadly, but also as a blessing, we began doing more funerals, because churches, we had so many young people dying. People often target Michael Brown Jr., as we should, because of the violence that was committed against his body and his family. But the truth is, Michael Brown was number 169 to die in St. Louis that year. And he was not the last to die in St. Louis. As so often is the case, for whatever reasons, a name gets picked up or a person gets picked up, but the whole community is hurting. The whole community is wounded. And so we began doing funerals for people who were dying, who didn't have church affiliation, but Big Mama or Big Daddy or Nana wanted them to have a church funeral. And we would allow them to use the church to do that. If they had a pastor, their pastor could do the service. But if not, I offered my services to them at no cost and became their pastor. So in August 2013, not 2014 when Michael Brown died, in August 2013, a 21-year-old young lady named Juanita lost her life in a drive-by. She was holding her 9-month-old son in a car with her boyfriend. The bullet is believed to have been meant for him, but it hit her in the head and she died instantly. Her big mama called the church and said, I heard that we can have our funeral there. And I became their pastor for that journey. And preaching that service, which was packed, over 500 people, as I said, there was standing room only. In preaching that service, there was a young woman who attended who was 23. Her name is Sierra Irby. She came to that funeral. She had not been in a church since she was 14 because she had been violated in a church. She and her family swore off church. She only came because Juanita was in the casket. She was there for the funeral. And after the service, she didn't say anything to me. I would not know that she had come. But she stopped at the door and she asked the usher for my card. And the usher gave her my card. My church cards, my pastor card, always carried my cell phone number on it. And to my knowledge, she never returned. I told you how many members I had, so I would know if she returned. She never returned. She never called me. She never reached out. And I didn't know any of this until August 9th, 2014, when Michael Brown was killed. It turned out that Sierra lived in Canfield Green Apartments, and she had gone out with her 2 children that morning to have breakfast. When she came back, they could not get back into the complex for all the people and the police. And so she walked in with her children, and they walked up on the dead body of Michael Brown. Her son, Jordan, knew Michael because he played with the kids in that neighborhood. And he began to scream and ask her, who killed Mike? Who hurt Mike? And she didn't have an answer. She went into her house and found my card. And she called me. And she told me the story that I just told you. And she said, you didn't know it, but since that day, you have been my pastor. And I need my pastor to show up in Canfield Green. That's how I ended up in Canfield, because I've always seen the pulpit as larger than the sanctuary. The pulpit should be open to the whole community. And I went because someone who considered me pastor called for me to come out into the street with them.
So much resonance in terms of just the ministry that we have, the doors of the church being open, and how being attentive to not only who comes in, but how we treat them when they come impacts whether or not people want us to come to them when they are in need. So thank you, Reverend Blackman. Reverend Marshall, I'm thinking about your journey in terms of pastoring congregations, particularly there in Pennsylvania, and the kind of bringing, I mean, it's hard to pastor one church. I'm a PK. So bringing together 3 churches and thinking about their formation, and particularly there in an urban community like Philadelphia. Can you just tell us about your story in terms of pastoral leadership and the cultivation of even your lay leaders? How has that impacted the work of transformation in the church and that community?
Well, thank you so much for this invitation. And I have been blessed to hear the story that Reverend Blackman just shared. And it really is a story that lifts up the power of the church, the power of women's leadership, and also really speaks to very much an important part of understanding the role of the church. I grew up as a PK myself. My mother is a pastor. And one thing my mother always said is, if our church was not here, would it make a difference? And it was a question to get us to think about how we are in relationship with the community. I like the term that Reverend Blackman used about being the church of the community, that we see ourselves with, that we are walking with, that we are in relationship with our neighbors. And so I am serving a church that has become, we like to say, 3 streams have become a new river. There's a collective history of almost 500 years of these 3 streams that have become New River. And then God has called with the idea that we can move forward and do a new thing. And one of the things that I have done as a leader is to make sure that we use our history as something that can propel us forward, that we can take the best of the histories of these congregations who have had in better days been able to serve their communities through ministries of compassion and love, to take what is best in our DNA and to move us forward into a new future. It is certainly challenging to do so. It involves 3 different identities, 3 different DNAs. So my central work over the last 2 years has really been like I like to think of it kind of like a gardener that you know, where I am plucking up and planting, plucking up. We are, and I should say we, because it's the work of the whole congregation. It's not my work, it's our work, that we are plucking up and we are planting some new roots, that we might be, like we like to say, a river through which the love of Jesus Christ flows. And so what has been really central over the last 2 years that I've been serving in Philadelphia is really, I'm concerned about faith formation and spiritual formation, which for me is about how our relationship with Jesus and his gospel shapes who we are and who we are called to be in the world. In terms of who we are, my core conviction comes from growing up in the church. And one of the first songs I learned was "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so." Yes, Jesus loves me. And so that has been and that has been a really core conviction for me to understand that we are rooted and grounded in this identity that is that tells us that we are beloved of God, and that the essence of our being is rooted and grounded in God, who is love. So at the core of who we are is the love of God, who calls us to emanate that love in the world. So we are bearing witness as such, and this is a key conviction for our congregation. We have been doing a lot of work around what it means to look like love, what it means to understand our core identity as being people of love. It is a key conviction. It has implications for the work of transforming the church in the society, because we live in a culture that is fear-based. We live in a culture that is fear-based, so that to transform the church and society from being a place that is fear-based to love-based is actually a revolutionary endeavor. And it is revolutionary at the core because to express that radical love of God towards us, we can no longer dehumanize one another. We can no longer be fighting one another. And that includes inside the church as well as outside of the church, right? When we talk about 3 congregations becoming one, we don't want to just be one in name, but one at the core, one in the spirit. And so love is revolutionary because to express it truly means we no longer dehumanize one another. To express it means we can no longer exploit one another, and that we have this call to disrupt and dismantle the structures, the attitudes, the policies, those things that will dehumanize and exploit other people. So, and no matter how these structures show up, love is an important part of making sure that we are disruptive to the death-dealing forces among us. Being in West Philadelphia means that I'm in a city that is known as the largest poor city in the nation. There's, I think, almost a quarter of people who are caught in the system of poverty. This year alone, there's been gun violence, a gun violence surge. We have all of the different inequities that you can imagine are right in the city in which I serve. And on top of that, we are now in a pandemic that has exacerbated or revealed all of the inequities that we are facing. And so we have much work to do. We have much of a we have a call to address and disrupt those the systems that are harming people, but including poverty and systemic racism. But also, love is constructive because the love of God means that we who are beloved bear witness to to bear witness to that love, and the fact that we begin to see. God gives us an imagination to see what love looks like. And in the words of the prophet Micah, that is to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. And so our congregation right now is in a discernment process of looking at the ways in which we are called to partner and work with the community to help be good neighbors and build up and address some of the ills that are happening. And we are working very intentionally to not be people who say we want to do something for somebody, but to do something with the community, so that people in the community are at the table as we're discerning and listening about how we can best use our collective gifts to address many of the situations that we are feeling. And that is really an incredible process for me. It has been a lot of administrative work in my work, and I've used and sought to use the administrative aspect of trying to bring it's like trying to merge three businesses and consolidate all the different assets of those communities. But in that work, also use the work to the process to speak to the love that we're trying to form in us, the love that we want to flow in us. In other words, one of the things that we concentrate is not just on what we're going to do and what we've done, but how we do it. That the process is just as important as the destination, and it engenders that formation, that discipleship that we want to live out in the world. And so how we do our work, the processes, and if I had time, I would talk about all of our processes, but we have processes for discerning and listening to God. And how we do that is very collective, and it's listening, it's collaborative. We have a process when we meet, when our board meets. We like to say our work is our worship. And so we try to design the way that we make decisions around how we enter worship. We enter in with praise, so we have time of devotion. We'll enter in with a time of response and giving. We'll have then the response having to do with what now that we've heard God's word, how do we relate what's on our plate right now? What decisions we have to make? How does what we have heard, what we have, how we have journeyed and praised God, how does that relate to the decisions that we need to make? And so we actually think of our board meeting kind of governing it around those movements of worship: entering in, greeting, response, being sent out. So just really trying to be intentional about how faith is formed, how love is formed, how we model that with one another, and then also how we share in that love and emanate that love with our neighbors around us.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this concept of moving from fear to love, or embracing love as a revolutionary endeavor, as a revolutionary act, this kind of resistance move or this revolutionary move. So thank you, Reverend Eustacia. For those who are joining, I see the comments populating even as we talk here. And if there are questions that are emerging for Reverend Eustacia or Reverend Tracy, began to drop those right in the chat as we continue this conversation. Both Reverend Eustacia and both you, Reverend Tracy, have experience not only as pastoring local congregations, but also leadership at the denominational level, meaning setting the course of not only one kind of church, but also multiple churches, or perhaps entire religious movement. So I'm curious, Reverend Blackman, how your vision of social liberation that you talked about, and its formation from the perspectives and leaders, activists there on the ground in Ferguson, now inform the leadership that you carry and hold for justice and witness in the UCC.
Thank you for that question, and I wanted to hear more too, Reverend Eustacia. um, so this is very public space, but you said it was open space and we should say what we think. I find denominational leadership to be challenging in terms of prophetic and priestly leadership. It is there, but it's very different. When you are in community, when you're in a congregation, whether that congregation is in a sanctuary or whether that congregation is in the public square because of something that has happened, what is important in that space is your proximity to the hurt, your proximity to the pain. And in denominational leadership, even though I can identify with that pain, I am not always proximal to it in the same way in communities. I can remember my first visit to the White House under the Obama administration and sitting in a room with the senior leadership there. And one person on the senior leadership table, doesn't matter who, saying to me, if we don't get ahead of this, A, B, C, D is going to happen in the streets, and we're not going to be able to turn it around. Well, you know what? The ABCD that he was describing had happened like 5 or 6 years before that conversation. You understand what I'm saying? And I made a mental note in my head that I never wanted to be so far away from the epicenter of hurt in my communities that I was disconnected that way, because he actually was trying, but was too far removed. Denominational presence causes some distance from the congregations and the communal presence that are necessary. In community, people are not looking for answers. They don't even expect you to have all the answers. Presence is more important than the answers. In denominational leadership, people are looking for answers and they want you to show up. They want you to show up where they're hurting and in the issues that matter. And I do that, but you show up in a different way because oftentimes there is no ability to create the collective presence that is needed for us to show up and figure things out together, right? So when you're in the streets with people, when you're in the neighborhoods with people, they don't want you to come with all the answers. They want us to figure it out together. As a matter of fact, we must figure it out together or we don't own it. In denominational leadership, you are here, and I don't mean hierarchical in terms of value. I just mean in terms of position, where we have over 5,000 churches who all have different personalities, who all have different levels of pain. We are coalesced around large topics like racism, sexism, heterosexism. We're against poverty collectively. But what does that mean to all of those different entities? Because we don't all define those things the same way. We don't all experience them the same way. So I am grateful that God has called me to this level, and it truly is God. But I am going to be honest about the challenge, because my heart is in connecting with people and the communal relationships that form in congregations and on the ground. It matters to me that I know your children's names and know your family and know where you live and know that this day is important in your life. And the further you get into denominational work, the more distance you become from that. It's got to be more of a big picture. I think I'll stop there because, I think I'll stop there. Don't hear me saying we need denominational leaders, but it's a different kind of leadership than that's on the ground.
Yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying. And I think that we are in the moment where we're celebrating you and Reverend Eustacia and so many. I'm thinking about Reverend Dr. Gina Stewart, so many folks who are now coming to the helm of those denominational bodies. But I'm also reminded, and I see Womanist trailblazer, Reverend Dr. Renita Weems in the chat, that she said once before that it ought to mean something when Black women take the helm, whether it's of an organization, of a church, or of a denominational body. In that sense, that transformational leadership for Black women cannot simply mean the replication or the imitation of patriarchal models or styles of leadership. So I'm curious, Reverend Eustacia, does the election or appointment of Black women either in the role that you previously served in or roles of other Black women that you know of at these kind of prominent denominational roles, represent a significant shift in these organizations? Are they shifting the landscape and the playing field?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you, Reverend Blackman, for sharing those challenges. And I think there is the short answer would be yes and no. That when we think about representation, there let me approach it like this. In leadership literature, there's something called the glass ceiling that women bump up against. It's a metaphor for structures that keep women underrepresented. But there's also something called the glass cliff. And the glass cliff is a symbolic term for what happens when organizations are about to fall off the cliff, meaning they are in decline, they are in hospice care, that there is, researchers are looking at the trend that when organizations come to the point at the glass cliff, that's when bureaucracies and institutions say, well, let's do something new. And we will see then the call of difference, people who are different, including Black women, as organizations wrestle with declension. And so, one of the things that phenomenon brings to mind is that organizations have a lot of cultural change that needs to happen. And what we're seeing with the election of women to head of denominational bodies or in certain places of authority is we are seeing representation because there's an awareness or there is a desire to do something new. But we are also seeing the challenge it is because unless those institutions, I'm going to go use that word dismantle again, unless those institutions dismantle some of the patriarchal logics and white supremacy logics that are embedded in the culture, then what happens is we can end up having a Black woman or a representation of Blackness and yet not really have fundamental change. And so it's really it really depends on the context and the leader and the willingness of the institution to really significantly shift. When I think about our context, my mom, just in full disclosure, also serves as the president of the mission agency, which is one of our 6 agencies in the Presbyterian Church. And I have observed, I've had the pleasure of observing the challenge of change. The challenge of fostering a new kind of culture that kind of disrupts some of the hierarchical or some of the processes that have been maybe not as helpful, and really actually to Reverend Tracy's point is really looking to really serve the local congregation, right? So that it's not a denomination coming in with the coats and the ties and the dresses and the suits and telling you what to do, but really trying to serve the local church and really create a process of change that looks not like a top down discernment process, but from the ground up, and really listen to where people are on the ground. That kind of work is very difficult in systems and structures that have been kind of operating with hierarchies. And so it is a two-edged sword. I think it should represent a significant shift. I think that the ability for it to really shift is if the culture will shift. And then oftentimes that means that the Black woman who's heading can be the target. So as the one who's trying to change, trying to help be move the culture, it also can create a tremendous amount of stress. And so there's a lot of dynamics that come to play when we think about women taking these positions. And I want to say that we'll have to really be very intentional about supporting women who come to these positions, that we have to be very bold to say that things, business as usual, cannot continue. And so that we can really move forward and have life-giving, life-producing institutions, if we can, right? Versus doing things as we have always done them with a Black woman in the front. So it is a maybe. It is a maybe for me because of the challenges and because of the kind of work that's required to really significantly shift the culture of our institutions, particularly in white mainline churches. I can only really speak for, where I'm located. The Presbyterian Church is a predominantly white institution.
I'd like to add to that, Reverend Melanie, if you don't mind, some things that have helped me. Uh, I was trying to answer your question directly, but I think it's important in this space to also say this. Um, some of these things were shared with me, and some of these things were things I've learned along the way. Some I learned early and some late. I would recommend to anyone who aspires in any setting as a Black woman to be elevated to that kind of leadership is that you count the costs before you go in, and you decide what cost you are willing to pay and where your lines are. And you have to know that going in because they're going to be pressed. I also would say, don't lose yourself in the process. The things that made you be identified as a leader are the things you need to take into leadership with you. And the fact is, often our way is not the way of everyone else. So it benefits me in denominational leadership, not from the congregational connection, but to maintain my sense of listening and modeling listening in the boardrooms, in the rooms where we're making decisions, bringing into that room the voices of people who I have connected with and who may not be represented in that room outside of me or outside of a few people like me, not being afraid to say this doesn't work for me because I've counted the cost. I also recommend that if possible, you don't let that be your only source of income. That frees you to be able to bring all of yourself into the room. Never allow yourself to become enslaved to the promotion that you have received. And it means that if certain things happen, you have to be willing to walk away. If certain people need your defense or you to stand up for them, you have to be willing to do that, having counted the cost. These things are important because if you don't have them, then you also become contaminated by the system that you're trying to deconstruct. I also would say, get you a circle of good girlfriends that you can trust. Get you a circle of people, and it may not be people, all of them may not be people you know right now, but get you some mentors, if you can, of people who are already doing what it is you're trying to do, right? People that when you get offered that position, and they present you with a package, and it's a package that you have never had to consider before, you need to talk to some people who have had packages like the one you're considering, right? So that you can make sure that you're getting what you're supposed to get going in. Get you a circle of people, not a large circle, that become confidants and prayer warriors, that you support each other on the journey and you don't feel like you're all alone. Bring all of yourself into the room because likely it is all of you that got you in the room in the first place. I just wanted to add those things.
I just want to flag, since I'm a teacher for my class, the words that we have been continuously saying throughout the semester in terms of cost, risk, even as we talk about revolution, right? Even as we talk about change and justice, there are some realities that we need not steer away from when we talk about leadership, this glass ceiling, glass cliff that you spoke to, Eustacia, in terms of, I see in the chats that, Black women being offered positions at churches or at positions that are already struggling or already on the place of decline, and then coming in and asking Black women to somewhat save those institutions. Accepting those roles bears certain costs and risks that we need to be somewhat aware of before we move into those spaces and those roles. Someone asked in the chat something about apprenticeship for these positions. And I think I want to ask it a little bit differently. Who are the leaders that inspire you to serve in these particular roles? Not necessarily the kind of model that says someone necessarily said, look, I'm doing this, let me give you all the tools to do it, and you come up and do it next, although that does happen. But who are the leaders that have inspired you, that you've seen as models for you on the journey in your roles?
Well, I'll share to your point. My grandmother is and has been a major influence. She didn't serve as a pastor. She didn't. She hadn't. She didn't serve in any particular denominational role, but she had a kitchen ministry. Uh, at her kitchen ministry, she would sit down with me, and she would share the family history. She would talk about being the daughter of my great 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 grandfather by the name of John Sneed, who was born into the system of enslavement, but he knew he wasn't a slave. And she talked about how he escaped from slavery. They believe that he was a carriage driver, knew the area, and that he ended up serving during the Civil War. And then when his infantry was captured, he escaped capture and went on to build along with Martha Sneed, my great 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 grandmother. And she would always reflect on this story of our family and from whence we've come. And she would tell the story all the time. And young, I'm like, okay, Grandma, I've heard this. But she would tell it like the first time every time. And she would always give me a couple of thoughts. One, um, that everything that God created is good. And she would talk about that in the face of living through segregation, and being told what you can't be and who you are, and really defying those kinds of messages. She talked about my great grandfather and my great grandmother, who did much to from the voting rights and served to be active to get voting rights, and my great grandfather going to vote even when it was at the risk of his life. And she talked about living out your values, living in courage. And she would always say the importance of living in service to humanity and using your gifts for the glory of God. And this was just a constant message that I, rolled my eyes and heard over and over and over as she was cooking. But it really, really formed my sense of call and my sense of embracing the risk. I'm not saying I like the risk of leadership, and some of the things that come along with it. There is something called leadership pain because it's risky. Leadership is often moving in places you haven't gone before. There is a cost she put something inside of me that really helps me to live into the difficult seasons. And then when you couple that with the prayer and the spiritual life that I saw in my grandmother and my mother, and other women in my family, that has been tremendously important. That I aim to be present as a leader, which means in the midst of all the risk, in the midst of the challenges, to show up, I need time with God. I need time to center myself. I need time so that I can be fully alive and be fully alive to the work, and moments to delight, moments to connect, moments, with friends and family. I need all of that to show up and take on, a call that can be very costly and also very joyful. There's another side. And so I think that I would say that the leaders in my family, the women in my family, tremendously poured in some of the values and some of the spiritual nuggets that I began to own as I got older, and it has really helped me to walk through the challenges of ministry and the joys of ministry.
I love that, Reverend Eustacia. I'll start with family members from that perspective. Growing up, I spent a lot of time with my great grandmother, who was a church mother in the Church of God in Christ. And my paternal family was Baptist. My grandfather was my first pastor. And what that meant, I'm 58 years old, so daycare was not the thing back then. You went to Big Mama's house when mom and dad went to work, and I spent my days with her. She wasn't formally educated beyond the sixth grade, but somehow she knew that Bible and she knew those scriptures. I always say she taught me to tell time. She couldn't teach me to read or to do math or any of those things, but I learned to tell time because every day we would pray at noon on our knees and we'd have to pull out. I had a little chair, she had a big chair, and we pull it out in this shotgun house and we'd have to pray for an hour. So my first time telling was to know it was noon because General Hospital would go off and then the TV would go off because it was time to pray. And it wouldn't come back on until all my children came on. And that was at 1 o'clock. It was my great grandmother who taught me the 23rd Psalm and the first hymns that I learned. My faith looks up to thee is the first hymn that I learned. And then she would parade me from door to door in the neighborhood, and I ring the doorbell and have to sing that song and say that 23rd Psalm prayer. And what that instilled in me was confidence in my voice and who I was, because they would come and they would listen to me and then they would clap and give me a piece of peppermint. I learned confidence in my voice. And I also learned, even though she was in the Church of God in Christ, that God loved me no matter where I was. She never tried to make me who she was. She loved me as I was. I learned that from my great grandmother and from my mother. And I'm proud to say that in my life, I learned that from my father as well. And so I've always been well loved. It's not something that I had to overcome. Professionally, and I had a whole professional life before ministry. I'm a registered nurse. I spent 25 years in healthcare. But in ministry, there are people that I look up to as mentors, whether they consider me a mentee or not, because I don't have to be in your close circle to watch your behavior and take what I can and learn from it. One of those people is Reverend Dr. Gina Stewart. I learned from Reverend Dr. Gina Stewart, who pastors in Memphis, Tennessee, the importance of staying proximal to the people. She is a world renowned leader, but she is very hands on with her congregation, very present in their lives. She leads from the center, and I love that about her. And I try to model those kinds of characteristics. I know Reverend Weems is on here, but I have learned from Reverend Weems watching her how to see not just women and others who are left out of the Bible through stories around the text, but to see them in the midst of the text and to illuminate the text in ways that it speaks to the actual conditions that people are living in. I've learned that from her, and I'm grateful for that, as well as having learned some of those same kind of techniques from Dr. Will Gaffney. As far as other women that I have learned things from that I consider mentors in my life, Bishop Vashti McKenzie, who was the first bishop consecrated, woman bishop consecrated in the AME Church. I loved the way that she owned all the space that she occupied. From the moment that she came into that role, she asked no permission to be who she was called to be. And I watched that in leadership in a predominantly male setting where originally it was just her. She owned it, and she owned it in her womanhood. She didn't try to conform to being anybody else in that. Francine Brookins, who has just been consecrated a bishop in the church, has that same bold brashness about her. She knows what she knows and she stands by it. And, you know, I don't want to leave out any of those bishops now that I started, Ann Henning Byfield as well. And Sarah Davis, who was a gentle leader, but whose strength was in her compassion and her care. I learned from Sarah Davis that you don't have to raise your voice to be heard if you have something to say. That matters. You know, another thing I would say from Benita Weems is I learned I said what I said period. All of these things are things that you take from people. I don't believe that you get to choose your mentor. Your mentor chooses you. So I'm not necessarily saying that I'm a student for these people, but I watch people's behavior and what works and what resonates with me and what I think shifts atmosphere. And I try to study that well. So out of the people that I named, there are a couple of those that are confidants for me and people that I don't have to have my makeup on to talk to, people that I can say I'm hurting with, people that can call me in when I need to be called in, people I can have those salary conversations with, or the struggles with saying no that I'm having in some places just because of the performative nature of being a Black woman and thinking that you have to figure it all out. Sometimes you need people to tell you that you don't have to be anybody but who God has called you to be, no matter what other people are saying to you. So there are others, but I certainly would name those. And I will close um, with one who has taught me so much, and that's my own daughter, because she sees me in all of my rawness. And she loves me and she challenges me and she calls me to a higher self as she has matured into the woman that she is called to be. And that's not a replica of me. And so I consider her as well as someone that mentors me.
I so appreciate the way that both of you just really traced your mother line and looked at these kind of intergenerational models, both elder or even younger, that have been sharing wisdom across generations. That the child shall teach, and that we, continue to follow our elders. That there's something that is happening as we learn and grow and are in community with one another. In the context of theological education, I'm thinking about Dolores Williams, womanist theologian Dolores Williams, who, when she was asked in 1978, what do Black women need in order to strengthen the programs that they encounter at theological institutions? And she said, we need more role models. We need more Black women. Obviously, she was pointing then at the faculty level, but certainly we can see that Black women are populating theological institutions as one of the fastest growing populations in theological education, which is why I suggest that the future is womanist, because the future of theological education, in my opinion, hinges on Black women. But I'm asking a question about both of you have went through journeys at theological institutions, and what do you need, or what could have helped you in your own journey? What could have helped you from theological institutions in order to prepare you for the work and leadership that you are doing now? This is a kind of curious and selfish question that I have for folks who are thinking about planning programs for current leaders. What might theological institutions do to encourage and inspire womanist leadership?
Reverend Melanie, you're doing it. You are doing a wonderful and necessary work. I think the first thing that comes to mind is something like this, a forum like this, is a very powerful way of exposing women to other women, and also giving us context for ministry and leadership that looks like us, and enables us to continue to ask the questions about our own call and our own story. And so I want to salute you and this opportunity, because I think it's really important. As Reverend Tracy was talking, I was thinking about Katie Cannon, of course, how we have been all impacted by her life, her willingness to say, do the work your soul must have. And she did her work, and we are here. Certainly, I'm even ordained in this denomination out of her line, because she was the first Black woman to be ordained in the denomination. So, just when I was in seminary, and I was in seminary from 2003 to 2006, Katie Cannon, Dolores Williams, Jacqueline Grant, these were optional kinds of a class on James Cone even. These were all optional readings. These were all kind of, for me, not a part of the main of the curriculum. And I think that to make womanist reading and leadership a part of the main curriculum is one way that will incorporate the voices that are necessary. Certainly, I have been tremendous, like in my pastoral leadership, I keep going back to these resources, especially as I teach and preach. And we just a few weeks ago, we looked at Job's wife, and we did a Bible study about her willingness to call a theological question when she told Job to curse God and die. that she was calling forth a question about the nature of who God is, and how God is working. And that's okay to ask some questions. I mean, just looking at all of our, there's so much that has been impacted in my own pastoral leadership, my own preaching and teaching, based on engaging Katie Cannon, Dolores Williams, Jacqueline Grant. These are readings that have been really important and have really expanded and opened my imagination, and helped me to see, and have been central to the work of that love that I'm talking about, that love as revolution that I'm talking about. All of their work, the womanist womanist scholars and womanist writings, really does open up, and has opened up a lot of my own imagination that I'm able to share with my congregation. So it's very practical for me. It's very pragmatic and on the ground for me when it comes to that. I also want to say that, and this is just kind of more of a general piece around theological education that I appreciate and that I want to highlight, is that theological education taught me how to evolve. And I'm just picking up on how the readings and the scholarship has impacted ministry, that it's okay to grow in understanding. I don't have the same perspective that I had entering into seminary, that I had leaving seminary, and I continue to evolve. And one of the things that I think for me about womanism is that the honor of the lived experience always brings me back to the fact that my faith is in a person, not a doctrine. And I'm not saying doctrine is not important, but I'm saying that there's a freedom to ask some questions, to think, and to honor the experience that that Black women are experiencing, and to bring that to the scripture, and to bring that in our interpretation of confessions and doctrines. And so I think that there's a real benefit of theological education. And for me, it really taught me how to evolve, and how to ask some questions, and how and ultimately say it's okay to bring my lived experience to the text, to the it's the womanist scholars. Let me say, it was the womanist scholars that helped me. That's why we need womanist scholars, because it was the womanist scholars that helped me to say it's okay to bring my lived experience into the scripture, and to our theological corpus. So I'll stop there.
It's odd that you asked this question tonight, Reverend Melanie. It is a painful place for me. I have a perhaps not as unique as I often feel kind of relationship with education. I was raised in Birmingham, Alabama, and from kindergarten till third grade, I went to school with people in my community. Um, Catholic school, but a lot of Black students were there. And then in third grade, my kindergarten teacher said to my parents that I needed to be moved. And my parents took that advice, and I was put into an all white institution, basically, from fourth grade. And from fourth grade until college, I never had even another Black student in a class with me. And it wasn't until I got to college that I had Black students in a class with me. And then it wasn't until seminary, which was much later for me, in my 30s, that I had another Black instructor since third grade. I've always grieved that. I got an education, I got a good education, but it was missing something. And I had to, even in seminary, though my seminary has changed a lot now, they are not who they used to be. But at the time that I attended, any class that you took that centered a Black voice, woman or man, was, as Reverend Eustachius said, extra. It was not the core of the work that was being done at that seminary. And I had to, as many others did, had to get it on my own. I have a library of womanist scholarship now. And I have books that I look to for liberation. I have all of those things, but I did it on my own. So deep is that hole for me that at 58 years old, I just started another educational program. And the reason that I did it is because I wanted the opportunity to be educated in my community by my people. I want that experience. I'm not saying that you can't do this work without it. Obviously, you can. I've been doing it. But there is something that is not transferable just on the pages of a book, but it is the spirit that is transferable when you are educated among people who you don't have to explain yourself to all the time, and who you don't have to decipher what you are trying to say emotionally, or people who get it because they too have a kindred spirit with some of the experiences that you've had. And so I want to say that any seminary or any theological education that is happening now that does not center Black women's voices, the Black experience, period, is not a place that you should attend, because there is something deeply missing that is deeper than books. Now, I grew up in a community that gave me that, and so for that reason, thanks be to God, I have some balance. But it is crucial, and it is crucial not just for the Black student, it's crucial for the white student. It's crucial for everyone who is in that institution, that they understand that whiteness is not the center of the world. And even as Black people, sometimes that is what is pushed. So I'll leave it there. I don't even know if I answered your question, but it's a very tender place for me. And I guess it will always be so.
I'm going to ask that you all share your final kind of remarks for us. But before you do that, I want to make space as a kind of point of personal privilege to say, for folks who are wanting to understand, womanist theology, womanist leadership, these terms that we're throwing around frequently, who either have never heard that terminology or are at theological institutions right now who have not centered the Black experience or womanist discourse, please take the time to check out our Womanist Leadership Theological Institute for continuing learners that is geared to that very kind of interest. That we offer courses throughout the year on various topics in womanist thought for the person who is looking for more engagement beyond what they either received during their seminary journey, what they're receiving now, or even while they're in ministry and just need more resources. So I want to offer that to you. Listen, I really could talk all night to y'all, but I know that's not fair to your time. But I want to, just invite you to share some final remarks. I imagine there is some bright sister or even brother who is discerning a call to ministry, discerning a new leadership path, and wants to hear from you. What's some final nuggets that they should hold on to as they begin to discern their path and their call and their vocation?
Neither one of us are jumping for this. I'll let you have the final word, Reverend Eustacia. Um, I would say that the greatest gift of ministry for me has been to give God an unqualified yes. It hasn't all been easy, and it's never going to all be easy. But I have never regretted the yes. It's an unqualified yes. I would also say something that I wish I had learned much earlier, but I'm confident in it now. And I'll say it here, although I almost got run out of some places for saying it. I have come to acknowledge and understand the Bible as a people's book about a holy God and not God's book about a holy people. It matters because if it is a people's book about a holy God, then the sacredness of it is in God's relationship with those people. And it is a reminder to me that my story is sacred too, that I too am chosen, that my story matters, and that my relationship with God is a part of my theological record of who God is and why I serve God. Those are the things that anchor me, that the stories of my people are sacred, the stories of my own journey is sacred, that I can look to the text and I can throw the pieces of the text that don't honor that into a place that don't keep me bound, and that I can use the text as the truth of God's relationship with God's people as seen by one set of eyes and honor other people's eyes as sacred as well. I would say to people who are entering ministry, don't lose yourself, that God doesn't require you to lose yourself to serve God, that God knew you were a woman when God called you and called you delightedly so. Be that woman. Bring all of that into ministry because so many people are hurting. And I would ask you, Reverend Melanie, you have such a platform that you have created, and people come because of what you are offering. I pray that there will always be these opportunities. People are gathering here because there is a thirst for community, and there is a thirst for transparency. There's a thirst for sisterhood. Thank you and so many others for answering that call, and I hope that will always be so.
Reverend Tracy, that's it. That's it. I mean, I want to say that there's a sermon that I read often, well, not often, but I would say at least once a year. And that's a sermon that Dr. Howard Thurman preached called The Sound of the Genuine. And it encourages us to hear the sound of the genuine. And I always come back to that because my unqualified yes has to constantly be dealt with. It's not a one-time event for me. I have to keep going back and saying yes and yes. It's a daily walk, and to hear the sound of the genuine, to hear and to live into the fullness of who God has created us to be, is a sacred matter. And Dr. Thurman says that you got to wait for it. That's your assignment. And that for me speaks to the real the real passion to listen for God, to take time in the hectic pace of the ministry to really take a moment to still ourselves. I have to always come back to that stillness, to that moment of solitude. And it's hard because I got two children and a husband. So it's not easy, but it is important for me to always stay in touch with who I am and who God has created me to be. And that's not a selfish matter because who I am is connected to others. And my call is connected to service to others. And so I want to show up. And so I just want to encourage those who are listening that you showing up does matter, and it is a sacred matter. And the yes, it will have to sometimes we have to keep pushing ourselves. We have to keep sometimes encouraging ourselves to say yes, but keep saying yes, because there is something important about each and every one of us in this work on earth. And Dr. Thurman says, if we don't hear the sound of the genuine, we will be on the ends of strings that somebody else pulls. And because God has not called us to be puppets, but to be people who walk in love, who live out that liberating love mission that Jesus has called us to live out, we want to be sure to do our work, to know thyself, and to walk powerfully in that call to which God has assigned.
Thank you. We are just so grateful. We have watched Reverend Tracy and Reverend Eustacia, your journeys of leadership, watch with anticipation to see all that God is continuing to do within you and through you. But we have learned from you, learned from your journeys. And we are here at Union and here at the Cannon Center very particular about our invitations and seasons and times to bring folks into this space. And I'm so glad that both of you said yes to joining us tonight and for making this conversation so meaningful for all who are present. I'm churchy enough to know that Zora had it right. There is something about the story, something that guides us, the ins and outs, how we approach it, the telling of our stories make it possible for transformation, for something to work in and through and between us. And so I am grateful to you, Reverend Blackman, to you, Reverend Eustacia, Reverend Marshall, for telling your stories, for opening up your hearts and your journeys with us. And we are so much better for it and because of it. For those of you who have joined us again for another conversation, again, we are happy to have you and know that we are continuing these dialogues. Next month, we will be presenting our webinar on critical race theory meets the Bible and theology. So we're continuing these conversations, expanding them and broadening them and bringing them into our contemporary conversations and concerns. So we ask that you join us on Tuesday, November 9th for that next conversation. Again, thank you to everyone who has joined us and have a wonderful and blessed evening.